Hello and welcome to the Short Story Workshop. My name is Matt Bowles. I'm here with Melody Bowles and Simone King. And today we're going to be doing something we haven't done for a while. We're going to be talking about my story, an original. It's called A Game of Scones. Let's call it a parody of some common fantasy tropes. It is a fantasy story. The world is being threatened by an evil force, but the guy who is supposed to save us just wants to bake a cake. It's very silly. If you think that sounds ludicrous, it's actually saying some smart things about fantasy and writing and saying why so many of the things we do in writing just are kind of strange. And so there's some interesting things we can say about it, but we'll get into that later. For now, just relax and enjoy. Here is A Game of Scones by myself, Matt Bowles. Crack the egg, the recipe said. The egg felt cold and hard in Solomon's hand. Weren't they supposed to be fragile? How could he break it cleanly? Solomon had one tool that could cut through anything with ease. He held the egg at arm's length, then drew his sword, the polished metal screeching a battle cry, or maybe a complaint. "I know, Moonsteel," he muttered. "I'm not used to this either." He focused on the egg in his hand, then swung the heroic sword in one clean motion. The top half of the egg popped into the air, but the yolk wobbled safely inside the bottom half, held steady between Solomon's fingers. A single clean cut, just as he'd been taught. "Not bad," Solomon muttered, sheathing his blade. "It truly is the finest steel in Galagon." Solomon added the egg yolk to the wooden bowl. His kitchen was not well equipped, but he would manage. Cornelia loved cakes, anything sweet really, and at 6'4", Solomon was rarely considered sweet himself. She definitely didn't see him that way. But when she saw his perfectly baked cake, her face would glow sunnier than the yolk of this egg. Someone hammered against his front door, 5 desperate strikes. "Solomon! Solomon Jaeger!" a man yelled. Solomon rolled his eyes. Not another one. He tried to read the recipe, but the man's insistent knocking kept distracting him. After struggling to read the same line 3 times, he felt a migraine creeping in. He sighed and went to answer the door. "I'm not interested," he said, before the man in the white robe could say anything. "Solomon Jaeger, it's you!" The man wedged the bottom of his staff in the doorframe. "I have grave news. The forces of King Diabolus—" "I know." The man's eyes widened. "You know? Then you must stop him right away. The fate of the world. Get Artorius to handle it." "If only I could. King Alucard charged him with treason and chopped off his head." "Of course. Regardless, you'll have to find someone else." Solomon gave his frankest smile, moved the man's staff out of the way, and closed the door. Solomon hated this hero business. He'd lived in this world for almost 30 years, and it didn't deserve saving. Heroes were rarely rewarded and often decapitated. Tragedies and heartbreak were all too common in Galagon, so he had to focus on baking the greatest cake Cornelia had ever tasted. What did the recipe say? Flour. 250 margs of it. But the bag that the merchant had given him for saving his cart was 500 margs. That was twice as much, wasn't it? There were too many numbers and flowery words. Solomon didn't understand it all, and he had new respect for Cornelia, who dived headfirst into this complicated world for fun. She often turned the eggs and milk from the farm into scones, pastries, and sweets of all varieties. She was too good for this world, and he had to win her over before she got tangled in some tragic tale. He turned the bag of flour around in his hand. He could understand cutting things in half well enough. He drew Moonsteel once again. The blow left a gash in his table, and a puff of flour coated his face and jerkin, but he'd done the job. A warrior could hardly expect to get anything done without staining his clothes. He busied himself mixing the remaining ingredients together. Cornelia lived on the other side of the village, on the farm. Sometimes he saw her in the fields, golden sun hat on her head, dress billowing in the wind, and he forced himself not to stare. They'd spoken several times, and every time Solomon had felt his face burn hot. He tried to hide behind her father, a much simpler being who Solomon understood, but it was hard to hide behind anyone when you're built like a wardrobe. If the forces of Diablo saw Cornelia's smile, he thought, maybe they wouldn't want to destroy the world anymore. She possessed great power without realizing. He heard a tap at the window. "Mr. Jaeger, you possess great power without realizing." Solomon glared at the window. It was a different man, and judging by the sword at his side, a fellow warrior. Still, just like the previous visitor, His hair was silver and fine. Solomon undid the latch and pushed the window open a little, forcing the man to step back. "Oh, I realize," he said, "but I don't care." "You don't understand," the man said solemnly, his face unreadable. He produced a battered scroll, its parchment a dusty orange. "The old legends speak of you, Mr. Jaeger, as our saviour." "You've got the wrong guy. It's a common name." "I think not. See this ancient scripture." The man unravelled the scroll, and it was like looking in a mirror. A drawing of a man who looked just like Solomon glared back at him, right down to the specks of flour clinging to his hairline. This was new. "That drawing looks ancient," he said. "Yes, quite. It's 1,000 years old. You are the one I have been looking for my whole life, the one who was chosen by the ancients to fight the forces of darkness. Come with me." Solomon shook his head. "These ancients are impressive, for sure, to foresee my likeness so exactly," he said. "But if they were so wise, why didn't they choose someone who wanted to fight?" "Mr. Jaeger." Solomon closed the window and pulled the curtains across. The kitchen was dark now, but it didn't matter. He was about to light the stove. In fact, the shadows cast by the flickering fire might lend the room a romantic air. Fire could be used to intimidate your enemies and manipulate their movements. It made sense, then, that the ingredients of his mixture would flee from the flames, causing the cake to rise. Before long, it was complete. The icing was thin and pulled at the edges, but it was satisfactory. Solomon went to wash his face and change his clothes, nerves building. It would not be the greatest cake that Cornelia had encountered, but it was his. Hopefully that would be enough. Surely she'd recognize its merits, considering it was his first attempt. She would arrive any minute. Solomon's feet tapped against the floorboards, but then he heard a ruckus outside. He had a feeling he knew what it might be. He opened the door with a sigh. Along the path in front of his house stood a long trail of people. Most had white hair, although some were bald, and most of them were men, but not all. Amongst them, Solomon recognized both the men he'd snubbed earlier, as well as many who had visited over the last week. "Why don't you ever listen?" Solomon said. It wouldn't do for Cornelia to arrive and find a party of mages outside his house. "Mr. Jaeger," the white-haired man of the staff said, "in our experience, the hero in question will usually give in and do as we ask, so long as we keep asking." The group murmured in agreement. "And who are you, exactly?" "We are the Society of Wizards and Prophets for the Prevention of Apocalyptic—" "So that's how it is. I thought you were misguided individuals, but you're all part of the same villainous wizard alliance." "Villainous? No, we're not villains. We're trying to save Galagan from destruction." "That doesn't matter," Solomon said. "You're in my way." After some yelling and sword-waving, the group fled, and not a moment too soon. Cornelia appeared at the end of the path, her hair tied up on her head in an unnecessary elaborate manner. Solomon cleared his throat. "Good afternoon," he said. "You're just in time for some tea." "Splendid," Cornelia said with a smile. "I was worried that I would be too early, but I could not resist stepping out in the afternoon sun a little sooner than I had intended." "Of course," Solomon said. "Come on in." Cornelia was going to great lengths to speak properly and politely, Solomon noticed. Even the way she sat down and sipped from her teacup was careful and reserved. She wasn't usually like this, but it was nice to see her making an effort. Could it be that she was just as nervous about their meeting as he was? "Since you were coming, Miss Brudeau, I took the liberty of baking a cake," he said, setting his creation on the table. "Oh," Cornelia said, "it looks lovely, but I do hope you didn't go to too much trouble on my account." "Not at all," Solomon said, cutting the cake with a knife, careful to move in a reserved manner and without violence. "I found myself curious as to your interests, and when I heard you enjoyed baking, I thought I should try it. Perhaps you can give me a pointer or two. I can't imagine my first attempt could bring an experienced baker much joy." Solomon pretended not to watch with bated breath as she took her first bite. This is wonderful," she said. "Your first attempt, you say? I never would have known had you not said so." "Oh, you flatter me, Miss Brudeau, I'm sure." There was that sweet smile. They chatted for a long time, and Cornelia updated him on all the latest news from the farm, to which he listened intently. He respected Cornelia's father a great deal. The man had managed to find himself a respectable yet peaceful life. Solomon sometimes wondered if he might one day help run the farm himself, if given the opportunity. But after a second slice of cake, Cornelia's voice broke. She looked downcast all of a sudden. "Miss Brudeau, is something wrong?" Oh, it's just... She paused, composing herself. This afternoon has made me very happy, Mr. Jaeger. I'm touched by the trouble you went through to make me feel at home. But in recent days, whenever I feel happy, I can't help but feel a pang of guilt. Solomon frowned. Whatever for? Cornelia wiped tears from her eyelids. What right do I have to be happy when people are suffering at the hands of King Diabolos? He's already sacked Abingdon, and you know that not even the women and children will be safe from his tyranny. It's simply not fair. If only some hero could set out to defeat him once and for all, then I could allow myself to be happy. In fact, I would gladly marry any man brave enough to do so, as presumptuous as that may be for such a stable girl as myself. Solomon lowered his head. Perhaps there was no escaping it. He had been foolish to believe that he could find a peaceful existence in a world such as this. Shortly after, Cornelia composed herself and left in a chorus of apologies and gratitudes. Solomon saw her off with a smile on his face, but inside he felt he'd lost the battle, and the next looked even more hopeless. It was an agonizing night. Cornelia's words replayed in his head, as did everything he knew about heroics. He remembered Paragon, whose victory in Morsum cost him his soul, leaving his body to wander the plains forever. Or Vasselheim, who had been on the brink of victory when his own kin had run him through. He was just as likely to get himself killed as he was to succeed, but what choice did he have? He couldn't be like Cornelia's father, no matter how he tried. His solitary existence would remain nothing but misery and loneliness. By morning, his mind was made up. He strapped on the sturdiest hiking boots, scraped a whetstone along Moonsteel's edge, and packed a bag full of supplies. If everybody wanted him to fight Diabolos, then that's what he would do. He would save the world, even though the world didn't deserve it. But first, he had to make a visit. He must tell Cornelia about his decision, so that she might await his return. Solomon walked to the farm, where he found her brushing one of the horses, her sun hat perched on her head. "Good morning, Miss Boudreau." "Ah," Cornelia said, turning. She saw his supplies and his hiking boots. "You're back from your trip so soon?" Solomon frowned. "I came to tell you that I would be departing." "I thought you left yesterday morning." "How could that be? We had tea yesterday afternoon." Cornelia paused. You must be mistaken. Shortly before we were due to meet yesterday, I received a message that you've been called away on urgent business," she said. "I haven't seen you for several days, Mr. Jaeger." Solomon's mind raced. Cornelia seemed perfectly sane, and he can't have imagined the whole thing. So that meant that the woman who had eaten his cake yesterday hadn't been her at all. "Excuse me," he said, and ran back the way he had come. There was only one explanation. Sure enough, his house was once again bustling with the members of the evil wizard alliance. Solomon barreled his way to the front of the group and grabbed the white-haired man with the staff by the neck, slamming him into the wall. "It was you, wasn't it?" Solomon said. "You are a wizard. You came in disguise and ate my cake to trick me into going on your quest." "I would never!" Solomon slammed his blade into the wall, inches from the wizard's head. "Choose your words carefully, wretch, and don't lie to me." "But you must go on the quest, Solomon," the wizard croaked. "It is your destiny." "How's this for a quest?" Solomon seized the wizard's robes, spun him around and threw him to his knees. He looked out over the wide-eyed faces of the Alliance. "Listen here, or God help me, I will cut this man down. Tell me where I can find your ruler. From where I'm standing, the only thing between me and a peaceful existence is this cursed evil wizard alliance, and I will not rest until I dismantle it one silver lock of hair at a time." Let's hear some first impressions.
The story made me laugh.
That's a good start.
I like the juxtaposition of the ordinary with the baking, with the magical world and all of its tropes of wizards and quests and evil tyrants.
Yeah, he achieves these very ordinary baking things in a very fantastical way, such as literally slicing the bag of flour in half with his magical sword, Moonsteel. I did enjoy that.
He's not that clever, is he?
I wanted a hero who is in the wrong story. I'm like, the things this guy is good at are not going to help him.
The writing advice I would normally go to automatically when writing stories is tailor your character for the story you're writing, as opposed to deliberately jarring the two, which I think works really well in this case.
It's used, I think, quite a lot in horror, because in horror you often want characters to be good at something, because we like people who are good at things. But if your character is good at the things the plot is demanding them to do, then you don't really have a horror story anymore.
And also a lot of times the things the plot demands people to be good at aren't that relatable.
So do you start with plot first or characters first?
I usually start with settings, honestly. But this one I started with plot, I think. Well, actually, no, it's hard to... Look, the first thought that came into my head, fully formed, was what if the hero of the story just wanted to bake a cake? Which is that a plot thing or a character thing?
It's half a plot character setting thing.
Yeah, so... Well, as Fitzgerald would say, plot is character, so...
I mean, I would agree with him. Well, certainly I think there's a significant amount of overlap if you're doing your story right.
Yeah. So I kind of wrote this 8 months ago or something. I did it all in one day. And I just sat down at it was like 2 p.m. And I was like, I want to write something, but I had no plans. Nothing was percolating in my mind like it usually is. I had a vague idea about having a hero that isn't suited to the story. Then this concept popped into my head, and I sat down and wrote like half of it, and then I stopped and decided what my ending would be, and then I wrote the second half. And that was it.
You don't know your endings when you start.
Not always, but I like to know my endings before I get to them.
Always wise, and yet somehow I never do that.
Well, everyone does it slightly differently.
What did you want to achieve from writing this story?
I don't really have a particular message, but I think having written it, you can tell the things I was kind of poking fun at. I didn't set out to do that. Really, I was just kind of rebelling against the idea that I'd written quite a lot of serious stories at the time, and I was like taking short stories seriously. I was like, what if I just write what I feel like and have fun with it and see what happens?
What I took from it was that sometimes in life you don't want to do things, but then sometimes it turns out you have to do them anyway because of the way the world turns. I'm sure I've been in situations like that where I'm determined I'm not going to do something, and then circumstances conspire against me and I have to do it anyway.
Can't escape your fate however much you want to.
Yeah. Sometimes you just have to bite the bullet and get on with stuff.
I think the inevitability comes from a lot of the things I was saying about the call to the adventure that we get in so many stories, where everybody knows that the hero is going to go on the quest and do whatever because that's the plot of the thing. But every time they insist at the start, no, I don't want to. Every time. And it was starting to bother me, I suppose.
Yeah.
And it's that feeling of inevitability is in there. Because you're like, well, we know what's going to happen.
Yeah, because we know our tropes and we're genre-wise.
Yeah.
Usually the refusal of the call is because the hero is like, I'm not ready yet, I can't do it for XYZ reason, or there's something I've got to do here first. But you kind of don't, in this story, it's just, no, I don't want to, I have cakes to make. Goodbye.
I've seen so many different kinds of refusal. Sometimes it's that they think they're not worthy. Sometimes it's like, oh, I've got other priorities. Sometimes it's like, no, I just got out of the game. You're trying to drag me back in. There's so many different ones, but they end up just being the same.
Why do you think we're so drawn to the refusal of the call?
I think it adds weight to the quest. You know, the hero, if the hero just went and was like, oh, sure, okay, then it would maybe cheapen it or make it seem too easy. The fact that the hero is like, no, I don't want to do that. That sounds hard. Kind of
yes,
emphasizes that it's not a sort of simple thing that they're going to go and do. It's going to be a complicated adventure with lots of ups and downs. So it helps build that sense of anticipation.
It's also relatable because not all of us want to get dragged out of our normal life.
Exactly. If Frodo was like, sure, I'll take this evil ring across Mordor and throw it in a volcano, that sounds fun. We'd be like, what is wrong with you?
If you go into something lightly without really thinking about it, it doesn't feel right.
Also, they just normally end up screwing it up if that happens.
Yeah.
Like the reckless characters always have a point where their recklessness comes back to bite them. At least, well, okay, not always, but in a lot of stories.
It's always a fun character trait to have that reckless character who's like, I'm going to do it anyway, because you can use them to push the story forward, but also have them do things that the hero cannot do because they wouldn't be that dumb.
There are a couple of other things that often happen as part of this setup that I wanted to kind of say, look, this is silly, and point the finger at it. Like, why is it always they decide who the hero is, and then they're like, you need to do this thing? And usually there's some like ridiculous justification. It just doesn't make sense.
Oh, what? The chosen one plotline.
Yeah.
Like, you're the only one on this world who can go and save us from this terrible force of evil.
The idea of being special and chosen, and also the pressure of feeling like you are the only one who can do stuff. Because yes, as humans we work together on problems, but when we're facing a real problems, it doesn't always feel like we have backup when we're dealing with them. So it can just feel like you alone are the one that's...
Yeah, I mean, it's a good way to focus your plot on your main character. But when you think about it, it's not really how things work out most of the time.
I suppose it's because people want to put themselves in the shoes of the hero and feel like that they've got this sense of purpose and drive and the ability to go do the quest and be the one who saves everybody.
Or the idea that you're chosen to do something you don't necessarily want to. You might have parents who have certain expectations for you to follow in their line of work, for example, in which case you'd feel like you were chosen for something before you ever got to make the choice. Like, a lot of our lives are structured, maybe not explicitly, but certainly implicitly, with the idea of go to school, graduate, go to university, get a job, get a family, have kids, get a nice house, whatever, next step. There's a real sense of a push towards not even necessarily attainable expectation, which I think resonates a lot in any kind of plot that has a forced prophecy or anything like that.
If you want to use a kind of fiction analogy, those kinds of things are like your plot line, right? Like, you need to be employed and so that you can eat. That's the plot in itself. And it's the kind of structure that hems us in as people that we have to follow. And all that this is really doing, or that fantasy is doing by having this kind of set of tropes, is making that explicit.
Fantasy is a good way to talk about the ordinary in an extraordinary way.
Yes. I think the problem I have with these tropes sometimes is that they have become so much a part of fiction, and even though they were originally designed to reflect some part of real life, now we don't really see them that way. We just see them as another part of fiction, and it's sometimes nice to go back and say, actually, this doesn't really make sense. And then we can try something that does something new, that does feel like it reflects real life.
Do you think too many writers kind of write by numbers and pick the same sort of story structure to use again and again?
No, I don't think we're wrong to reuse the same structures. But it's also worth re-evaluating those structures when you are using them.
Rather than just using them just because.
Yes.
I liked the plot twist about the evil wizard being Cornelia during her visit. You could tell she was behaving oddly, but my first thought was that she was frightened of him, because, for example, he was like a great warrior, and everyone in the village was pressuring her to make knives in order to get him to go on the quest. It was kind of where I thought it would go, so it went in an entirely different way that I appreciated.
I just took it that she was so good and so nice that she just really was that worried about the whole world. I thought it was sort of an extreme take on the, like, virtuous heroine kind of character.
It kind of works because of that. Like, a lot of this story is doing the trope and then pointing the finger at it and saying, look, isn't this stupid? If I do the trope of having this overly nice female love interest and then point the finger at it and say, this is stupid, when I later say, actually, that's not what happened, you're like, of course.
Yeah, I really like that. So I was thinking at first that she was quite unfleshed out as a character. Like, she liked baking, and she was basically what the protagonist wanted. But beyond that, she didn't really have much of a personality compared to Solomon, for example. But I ended up coming to the conclusion that it did work because the story was so reliant on playing with traditional tropes.
Yeah, I mean, she's really not in it.
She's really not.
She's only really, like, mentioned and then she's in at the end because the other conversation is the wizard in disguise.
Yes.
Yeah.
I didn't pick up on her behaving strangely. I was just like, oh, yeah, of course. She's gonna try and send him on the quest as well because...
Nah, I was worried it was going to get horrible because he felt rejected or something. Like, I didn't think it would because I thought I know you a little bit, so I thought it probably was not going to go into that direction. It's Matt's story. But also part of my head was slightly tilting of like, oh no, is this going to go badly if she says she doesn't like the cake?
Well, You never know with me. I try to keep people on their toes.
He did have Moonsteel right there in the kitchen.
Yeah. Like, you did a good job making him likable, but you also made it quite clear that he was fairly dangerous and perhaps not that smart, so
Yeah.
could have gone either way.
There's also kind of a comment on how a lot of fantasy stories have just gone really dark now. Well, one of the main reasons I don't like that is when you try and put that back with the old fantasy structure of, oh, we're going to save the world. It's like, why? This world sucks.
Like, the whole point of fantasy is that, yes, things get bad, but beneath it all, there's good. It's why there's that, like, iconic speech in Lord of the Rings of, like, I'm going to destroy Tolkien fans because I can't remember the exact quotation, but, it's the idea of that how can we keep going when there's so much evil in the world? And it's like, well, because there's still good, which I think is something that some fantasy stories are missing at the moment.
Yes, exactly.
Do you think there's a line between having a good, flawed hero and then becoming an unlikable villain protagonist?
I mean, we have to be sympathetic towards the main character. We don't have to agree with them or even like them, really.
No.
We just have to want to know what's going to happen next.
Yes. Like, obviously it helps if your characters like your character or find them relatable, but it's not necessary.
Yeah, I think if the character is properly set up as the protagonist, they have a lot of leeway on morality and this kind of thing. Because as long as you justify it, people can accept more than you might expect.
Also, not everything in a story needs to be justified either. You can just have a protagonist who is a bad person.
Yeah, I think it's harder though.
It is, but you can also get great works of fiction based on that. Like, for example, Humbert and Lolita.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
Like, phenomenal book. Same with Patrick Bateman in American Psycho. Like, the story wouldn't work if the main character wasn't appalling. So I think there is a space for those characters.
And I think just being in the perspective of the character, like, boosts up how much we sympathize with them anyway, because we see things through their eyes. We kind of feel like we know them.
Yeah, or at least it forces the reader to be complicit with their actions because we know about them.
One of my favourite things about reading is getting to empathise with these people who are quite different to me. But I do have a soft spot for the traditional hero, the swashbuckling do-gooder who's out to make the world a better place.
Yes, my favourite characters are often the ones that are just noble and good.
It depends on the kind of noble and good. I like characters who are kind. I don't necessarily need them to be chivalrous or perfectly polite or honourable in the way of the kind of classic quintessential hero.
I am a sucker for chivalry. Even if they're outwardly quite a spiky character, if through their actions they're still quite, chivalrous towards others, I'm like, yeah, this is a good character. I enjoy them.
These are the kinds of characters who, they're not perfect, but they are trying to be, and they have a certain amount of self-awareness, and they can see their own flaws, and they kind of understand what they want to do, and they usually do it well.
Yes. Like, it's not the same as creating a character who is perfect and flawless and just a general good guy, because frankly, those characters are annoying as hell. Like, your character's flaws shouldn't all secretly be character weaknesses they can't help.
And there's so many, there's so many flip sides of having a character who is just the knight who is trying to do well. Like, you can play off their ambition, you can, make them tunnel vision on their goals. There's so many ways you can give them things that work against them without compromising that core part of their character.
Yes. I think the Good Place made a really good point of, you can try very hard to be good, but in this day and age, it's so difficult to be good. And I think that's, to a certain extent, far more interesting to explore in contemporary characters than solely cynicism.
Trying to think about where your character falls on the scale of cynicism to idealism.
He's not very idealistic.
Yeah, he's pretty cynical.
But he's cynical in a kind of sweet way, as opposed to a I hate everyone way. It's not like these people deserve to die, it's more I deserve to have a life.
He has an idea of this ideal life that he wants. Just happens to be the opposite of what the story wants for him.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that in that sense he's somewhat idealistic, but I think even though he has dreams, he's very doubtful of his ability to accomplish anything, which is what makes him cynical.
He made the cake, though. He succeeded.
He did make the cake, but he wasn't very confident about how it worked out. He succeeded, but he said this kind of sucks.
First steps are important. I was rooting for his romance with Cordelia, so I was very sad when it turned out it wasn't actually her. That said, the ending. I feel like it ended very abruptly. No, I agree. I thought it looped around really well as a kind of circular ending. I don't know what it was about. I think I just expected, I don't know, even if it was just one more sentence, and I couldn't tell you what the sentence was. Just something. I don't know if it's maybe because it ended on dialogue without any reaction.
I know what you mean. It kind of ends. I think the thing is that it ends like exactly on the climactic moment, right? There's nothing after it.
I know, I almost expected like an image of the cake kind of crumpled and sad and forgotten on the floor or something.
That would have been too sad of an ending. We couldn't do that.
It would have, but it would have been. I mean, you know me and Angus. But
It's not that kind of story.
Yeah, I didn't really know where the story was going as I was reading it. I was like, well, okay, I guess he's gonna go. Like, it took several turns, I suppose, when in terms of my expectations. I was like, okay, he's gonna bake a cake and become a farmer. Sounds good. Then she comes and she's like, oh, well, you have to go save the world first. And then I'm like, well, he's obviously gonna go save the world then. Then he finds out that the wizard was the one who came and told him to save the world. And then it takes another turn where he's like, actually, no, I am going on a quest, but not because you told me to.
Yes. And this was because I'd already established pretty much that him going on the quest is inevitable, no matter what he tries to do to get around it. At least by the halfway mark I had. And I couldn't just not do that, because that would seem weird. It would be like, oh, he succeeded. It would have been strange. So I need to have him go on a quest, but I can't just have it be the simple, oh, he does what he's been told to do, because that would also be kind of boring. You got to find the third way.
I agree. Like, even if he'd gone on the quest and then gone back to Cornelia and something had gone wrong, it just wouldn't feel right there, because that's not where the key question raised by the text is. Like, it's not about whether or not he gets his happy ending, it's about whether or not he takes the quest.
Yeah.
I think it's a really neat structure. I like it.
Do you have a favourite kind of ending you tend to revert to, or is it a kind of different style of ending each time?
I struggle with endings usually. I find it the most difficult part to get right. And I think one of the things I look for is making sure that I've fulfilled everything that the start of the story sets out to do, and that I haven't just left anything. You know, if people are expecting a certain kind of ending, then you need to give it to them. But also, I want to do it in a surprising way. And sometimes this gets me in trouble, because I try and put something different in at the end, and people are like, this isn't what I expected, it doesn't really work, it doesn't make sense. And it's sometimes difficult to balance those things. You want to do an ending that feels like it's earned and it fits in the story, but is also not just what we thought was going to happen anyway.
I guess it's the conflict between the character want and the character need.
Very rarely in my story do characters get exactly what they wanted.
The happy ending is getting what you need, not what you want.
If they do get what they wanted, then it's not how they expected. You know, it's never fully one way or the other. It's got to be something in the middle.
Yes, otherwise you get that kind of wrapped with a bow feeling, which...
I like when on the course of their journey they change what they want.
Yes, well, they get a better sense of what they actually want.
It adds well to character growth.
Yeah, and you're also fundamentally changing your story partway through. It speeds up the pace, right? It gives you something fresh and more interesting. A lot of story structures have the turning point in the middle, and because you have that big change in the middle, it gives the rest of your story momentum, and it means that it's not just what your first act set up. You've got another element as well.
When I write endings, I try to leave them open to let the reader imagine what they want, but I think sometimes it means the ending is vague and people aren't satisfied with it.
I think it depends on how well it's written as an open ending.
Yeah, I think you need to make sure you tie everything up well when you do an open ending, because you need to make sure you've answered the core question of the story, or people are going to be like, well, you didn't finish the story. So you have to be careful with them. I'm sure at one point every time I did stories with, and then they had coffee, and maybe they went in a relationship and maybe they didn't.
think the more threads you have, the more the reader will expect it to click together and an oh my god moment of satisfaction at some point.
I would hate if I got to the end of the story and they were like, well, maybe they saved the world. So, Matt, we've kind of talked about like the satirical elements of this. Give us like a rundown of the, I guess, top tropes you wanted to point a finger at, just to summarize.
Okay. The chosen one, refusal of the cool, grimdark in general. Every character in the story is a trope in itself. Those are the main ones. Really, it's not like I sat down and thought, hey, look at these tropes, they're really annoying, I'm going to write a story that makes them look silly. It was more that I sat down to write a story that would be fun, and I just kind of got thinking about the structure of so many fantasy stories, because I was trying to write a fantasy story, and I thought, hang on, this doesn't really feel real to me. And then I kind of just turned that into a joke.
Okay, so the last one, I think, Simone, you wanted to talk about representation of women?
I feel like we need a final question to wrap up. What's your favourite ending to a book that you've ever read? A recent one I loved was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. Loved the ending of that one.
Oh, this is difficult because I can't talk about it because I'll spoil it. But it's got to be I Am Legend. If you haven't read it, it's great. It's great. It's an apocalypse where there are zombies/vampires. They act like zombies, but they're also vampires. They're scared of crosses and what have you. And most of the story is the main character trying to figure out, hang on a minute, why are these guys so freaked out by garlic? What is it about running water that makes them not come in? This doesn't make any sense. And he does lots of scientific investigations. And then the ending works perfectly and tells you why the title is what it is, even though the title makes no sense.
Before we finish, can I do a shout out to my favourite moment in the story? I like the bit where the wizard shows him a drawing of himself on the paper, and it looks exactly like him, down to him having the flower in his hair. And he's just like, oh, that's very impressive, and then shuts him out.
That made me laugh.
Yeah, I really enjoyed writing this story. It's one that, when you put a story aside for a while, like when you come back to it a few months later, at least for me, it's like spinning the roulette wheel. I never know what I'm going to think about it. Sometimes I'm like, what was I thinking? This is awful. Sometimes I read it and it's way better than I thought it was. But this one is just, every time I read it, I'm like, yeah, this is good. I like it. I like it a lot, which is nice.
But then other times I come across my own writing and I'm like, oh god. Oh no.
Yeah, it happens. I like to think that maybe if we just write enough stories, then, we'll be the monkeys who write Shakespeare eventually. All right. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. You can find all of our previous stories and episodes on our website at theshortstoryworkshop.com. If you'd like to contact us, you can do so via Twitter. I am at MattPWriter, and Mel
At Ficaholic.
and Simone.
Me_M_typewriter, also known as the modern typewriter.
Perfect. Now, don't usually ask, but if you could just give us a quick follow or rating on Apple Podcasts, it would only take a moment. It'd really help us out. Till next week, we'll be back with another story then. And now, goodbye.